BP's initial attempt to stop the massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico has failed. Over the weekend, the company placed a giant 4-story containment box over the spill, but the box kept getting clogged with ice crystals. An estimated 3.5 million gallons of oil have spilled since April 20th. Well, author Peter Maass writes about how oil has resulted in devastation around the world in his new book, Crude World, The Violent Twilight of Oil. Maass spent 8 years traveling the globe to discover the costs of oil production to the planet. He's an award-winning investigative journalist, an author, and a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. He's joining us now from Boston. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Peter Maass. Talk about BP in the global context.
Well, BP is, of course, one of the largest shareholder-owned companies in the world. And it's had actually, even though its slogan it tried to re-engineer into meaning beyond petroleum, it's actually had one of the more checkered in recent history records, particularly on the environment. There was a very large explosion at one of its refineries in Texas City about a couple of years ago. It also has spilled a fair amount of oil in Alaska. And so even though it's tried to foment this image of being the greenest of oil companies, actually it's had a significantly more difficult, troubled career in terms of environmental problems than some of the other companies that we know even as well or better, such as Exxon and Chevron.
And what about this latest attempt to cap the explosion, the leak that has failed on the part of BP?
Well, this is somewhat a reflection of the new territory, quite literally, that BP and other oil companies are in these days, because the kind of era of what's called easy oil, that is oil that's close to the surface, that's on the ground rather than under the water, that era is pretty much over. And so all these oil companies, particularly the Western shareholder ones that don't kind of own reserves themselves because they're not state-owned companies, they don't have kind of, natural territory that is theirs, they have to go into places that they didn't used to go into. They have to go far offshore. They have to go often to far reaches of Siberia or the Sakhalin Peninsula or whatever. They have to go very deep, very far into new areas using new technologies that really haven't kind of been proven, because these are the first times that they've been used. And so when you have a big accident, you're basically dealing with it for the first time in an incredibly challenging environment out there in the Gulf of Mexico at a depth of 5,000 feet. So each time you have an accident, you have to try a solution for the first time. And so in this case, for example, the solution isn't working. They're going to keep trying to work on it. But it just shows kind of how much they have to deal with in the way of new challenges and the dangers, therefore, that exist when you have to go into new terrains, deep water, for example, and get oil, because the easy oil is pretty much gone as far as these companies are concerned.
When President Obama announced the giving out of permits for offshore oil drilling, where he got a tremendous amount of criticism from environmentalists and others who live along the coast where this drilling would take place, he said that new technology, prevents the kind of spills that, we saw a few weeks after he made this announcement. Now the Center for Biological Diversity reports that the Obama administration is continuing to exempt new offshore drilling operations from environmental review despite the Gulf disaster. Since the disaster began on April 20th, the Department of Interior's Minerals Management Service has approved 27 new offshore drilling permits. All but one of the projects were granted the same environmental review exemption used to approve BP drilling. Your response, Peter Maass?
Well, this in a way isn't too surprising, because in so many areas when oil extraction is concerned, the Obama administration really is not much different from the Bush administration, which wasn't that much different from the administrations that preceded it, because the first priority is to get oil, to get control of it, to have it at reasonable prices. And this is something that crosses over Democratic and Republican administrations. So one shouldn't really be that surprised that the Obama administration isn't terribly different than the Bush administration. I mean, there are dictators all over the world who possess a lot of oil, whom the Bush administration dealt quite closely with, and the Bush administration was criticized rightly for that, whether it's Theodore Obiang in Equatorial Guinea, whether it's Nursultan Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan. But you have a new administration and you have different rhetoric, but you have actually the same policies in place. So, the lack of a clear break between the Obama administration and the Bush administration, though there are improvements, isn't terribly surprising, because when you kind of get down to it, American consumers do want to have their gasoline. They want to have their gasoline at the cheapest price possible. And so for, administration after administration, it has meant getting the oil wherever it is. And there was a brief moment, of course, we're all kind of somewhat famously aware of it, when Jimmy Carter put solar panels up on the White House roof and was going to try to direct the country into a somewhat different energy future. But of course, that all changed. Reagan became president, the solar panels were taken down, and 30 years later, we find ourselves at this position where we still, when I say we, I mean American consumers, still want their gasoline, still want their cars, and aren't ready to make the investments that are necessary, the changes that are necessary. And so in some ways, the Obama administration certainly isn't leading us to a new direction, but neither are they really being encouraged to lead us in a new direction by kind of large population in America.
You begin your book, Crude World, with J. Paul Getty's quote, "The meek shall inherit the earth, but not the mineral rights." Peter Maass. This
is something that, kind of, in one way it seems obvious, another way not so. We have this idea that countries that have oil, lots of oil, are lucky, kind of Beverly Hillbilly style. If you find oil in your backyard, you're rich and everything goes quite well. The reason I put that quote at the beginning of my book is because what happens, or what tends to happen in most countries that have a lot of oil, is that they don't become rich because of it. Some people become rich, but not the population at large. They don't tend to become more democratic as a result of it. In fact, they tend to become more authoritarian as a result of it. And they also tend to suffer environmentally as a result of it. The United States, as we're seeing now in the Gulf of Mexico, is having a new experience with the environmental cost of extraction. So the kind of bottom line here is that the people who should benefit from oil, for example, in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, which is where most of Nigeria's oil is located and where I went for this book, the people who actually live atop the oil, who should be the ones to benefit most directly, actually are the ones who suffer the most, because there's an environmental disaster in the Niger Delta which kind of dwarfs what Louisiana is now facing. They're also kind of facing deprivation of political rights in the Niger Delta. There's a war going on in the Niger Delta over who controls the oil itself. And so the upshot is that rather than becoming richer, individuals tend to become poorer in these countries. When I say individuals, I guess specifically referring to those who don't usually have access to political power. We're going to break, then come back to this discussion. Also hear about a court case involving Chevron and a documentary filmmaker. Chevron has just won the right to take the outtakes of his film. Peter Maass, we want you to stay with us and also weigh in on this. Peter Maass is an award-winning investigative journalist and author. His latest book is called Crude World, The Violent Twilight of Oil. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Take back your offshore drilling machine. We'd rather keep our water clean. And you have lied too many times. Our children will pay for your crimes. You said you were gonna utilize it, but all you've ever really done is brutalize it. We've learned something from the hell you've put us through. It ain't up to you. It ain't up to you, big oil. Why you